Introduce to you Dr. Maureen Kelly.
Keeley.
I'm sorry. Dr. Keeley came to Texas State in 1995, and she earned her bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Arizona and her PhD from the University of Iowa. She is very interested in interprofessional communication, and recently, due to personal reasons, she became interested in end-of-life communication. And so this led her to write a book called Final Conversations, which she's going to talk to us a little bit about today. We're very happy to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to, I've been working on this program of research for the last 5 years, and I have 6 academic publications on this material, and I'm going to try to cross between the academic work and this work. Now, it makes it sound like this isn't academic work. It is, but this is written for the popular press or trade books, and it is written for everybody. It's written.
Don't worry, just
okay.
say enter.
Just hit okay. This is written for all the family members and friends and who have someone they know who is dying. 8 years ago, my mother was dying, and I'm a professor of interpersonal communication. I should know how to do this. And I remember flying to Arizona to go help take care of her, and my 2 sisters and I took turns. My 2 sisters are nurses. I'm the non-medical person. We would take turns taking care of my mother, and I remember going to the bookstore once trying to find something to make sense of what I was going through, and how could I talk with this woman who I loved, and how could I let her go, and what would I say? And my mother was a very private person, so having conversations with her were not necessarily easy, which is probably why I study interpersonal communication. So I went looking, and there really is nothing out there. Any kind of popular literature that's out there is often a first-person, dying person story, which I think is very important. There are a few psychology or sociology perspectives out there, but all of these say communication's good. Go do it. Is it good? What does it look like? What kind of conversations do we talk about? And as I started thinking about it, we learn interpersonal communication from models, from examples, from we don't come out of the womb saying, "Mother, I would like a bottle." No, we come out of the womb crying, and then we say eventually "Baba," and eventually we say "bottle," and eventually we're taught to say, "Mom, may I have a glass of milk, please?" We have examples throughout all of our lives for almost every impersonal dyadic interaction that we have that's important, except end of life, because it's a private affair, and it should stay private. But if we don't have models, it increases our anxiety, it increases our fear and frustration, and so what it seemed to me people were doing was when mom or dad or my husband or somebody was, not my husband, somebody was saying that they were dying, they would go, "Oh, you're not going to die, you'll be here next year." And they're missing these wonderful opportunities, tremendous opportunities. And I remember writing down 2 words during that time that my mother was dying, and the 2 words were called terminal time. And I remember thinking that terminal time offered us an opportunity. It was a window of time to slow down the world. I was a working mom, professor, 2 little ones. I had 1 little one at the time who was 14 months old, a baby. I got to go see my mother once a year if I was lucky, talk to her once a week. I spent 9 weeks out of the last 4 months with her, taking care of her, sitting next to her, watching TV with her, laughing with her, telling stories with her, whatever it might be. And so I really wanted to start looking to see what other kind of experiences people had. And I hope to encourage people to have those conversations. Well, writing academic articles is wonderful for all of us who are professionals, and we'll go look at that and learn from each other. But I really want the word to get out to everyday person and for them to have some models. And so Julie and I talked with 82 different individuals about their final conversations, and they were retrospective interviews. And they told us what kind of messages they received, that they remembered receiving, and what they meant to them. And I actually have a lot of belief in retrospective interviews when it's about a topic that sticks with you. You remember these conversations because of the terminal time, because you know it's important. So that's kind of where this got started. And if anybody at the end of this wants to know more about the books, I actually brought some extra copies. They're $25 in the bookstore. I'll send it to you for what my cost is with all the shipping, which is $20, and no one has to make change, which is good for me. Okay, so I'm going to try to... Good. And if you don't mind, I'll just sit here and I'll sit and talk. Okay. I remember finding this quote, and it is, in order to tap the depth of meaning available to those facing death together, we must embrace what we mortals fear and ordinarily avoid with every fiber of our being. We must turn toward death together. So how do people turn toward death together? Communication, time. We have to spend that time together, and in those moments, hours, days, whatever you get, you have an opportunity to communicate and really connect with individuals. The end of life creates an opportunity to turn toward death together through final conversations. So what are final conversations? We had lots of people who wanted to talk to us, but we had to create the parameters for this research project. Well, I had to. The parameters were any final conversation would include all interactions, verbal and nonverbal, that a participant had with a loved one that was dying between the point of a terminal diagnosis and the moment of death, and both individuals had to be aware that one was dying. Many people who look at the research, they just look at the words, and I think you miss a tremendous amount, because one of my areas of expertise is nonverbal communication, but relationally, we send so many messages through a touch, through a look, and so I want to make sure that was included. And the reason why we did it from the point of terminal diagnosis, now that could be years or it could be months. Most of the people we talked with, it was within months or weeks of the person dying. In a few instances, it was within hours of dying. But as you all know, much more than I do, the hours before they're dying, they're not having long conversations, right? They're close to death. And so that's why I really was trying to have people reflect back on all these conversations that they had in this window of terminal time. So what is the death culture in the U.S.? Why is it so important for us to look at? Well, first of all, we have all these social and cultural trends to avoid death. Don't talk about it. All the commercials these days. Go plan your funeral before so your children don't have to worry about and make those plans. You know, don't talk about death. We're all going to live to be 100, or now at this rate 150. We really have lots of messages about don't talk about death. A century ago, Grandma and Granddad died at the house, and their wake was in the parlor, and the kids would run around, and so you would see death. You were more aware of it. So when you see it, and you see it as a natural part of life, which it is, you're not as afraid. Right now, it is not seen as a natural part of life. It is meant to be avoided. It is meant to be postponed, and we're supposed to run and hide from it and not talk about it and maybe whisper about it. And I think that's creating some of this anxiety that the everyday person feels. So death is also considered depressing and morbid in the United States. Again, it's not a natural part of life, which is crazy to me. It's removed from view. It's behind closed doors, especially hospital doors. And the bottom line is people, everyday person, especially, we don't know what to say or do. And I'm guessing that even from talking with Dr. Sanchez, many doctors and specialists, medical students, when they're first coming out, they don't know what to say or do either, because it's an uncomfortable thing. Doctors are supposed to save life, not help people have a good journey to the end. Majority of doctors. And so I think that this is important research for us to start the conversation. And this is a qualitative, descriptive study. So what is a communication perspective? First of all, we focus on the messages. What are the verbal and the nonverbal messages that have meaning and functions? So what does it mean if I put my arm on Elaine's, my hand on Elaine's arm? What does it mean to have that final look at before the person dies? What does it mean when you say, I love you? And it sounds like that would be pretty simple. No, love has lots of different meanings for individuals. Functions really is looking at what is the outcome of these messages. And this book is organized according to different themes that our individuals talked about. Everyday talk, because you can't have these profound conversations all the time. Love, heartache release, which would be the difficult relationship talk that we have. Identity messages. It's amazing what were the messages that the survivors remembered. So we'll look at the meaning and functions. And we also look at the individuals. So it is, if you're looking at the interpersonal, it's at the dyad, two people. If you're looking at it as a team of doctors, that would be more group communication. But we're actually looking at the communication from one or more individuals' perspective. The context is really important, right? Meaning changes depending upon the communication, depending upon where you are at, and the timing of it, and the type of relationship that you have. At the end of life, the individuals who get to have these conversations are the close loved ones. There are gatekeepers who keep people out, thankfully. What does it mean that you actually get to have time with this person? And how do you slow down the world enough? How do you say no to the PTA meeting, to the work schedule, to all the demands that we have on our lives to actually spend time at the end of life? And so the context, I think the context end of life is a very profound window, and that's what this perspective is looking at. But with any kind of communication, you have to look at the context. And I think I said this already, but most end-of-life research has been psychological, sociological, I was supposed to say medical, sorry about that. Media, and I've done this, I've gone through PowerPoint, Chris, oh, she's gone, like 3 or 4 times. But we, and I think they're all wonderful perspectives, but I think we're missing the perspective, and that is the communication perspective. What is actually being said, and what does it mean? So I look at the living person's perspective, and we define them as dying and living. It sounded better than survivor. Living is all the close family members or close best friends who are invited in at the end of life to have conversations, and the dying are those, obviously, who are dying. Most of the research is on the dying person's perspective. Again, I think it is a very important perspective. I just think we're missing a whole aspect of it. If we can start talking to the living and understanding more about some of their needs and some of the communication that is occurring, and encouraging them, telling them what kind of communication they can have. Because often the living are talked to as, well, you need to go talk to him or her because they need closure. Or you need to go talk to him or her because you need to find out what their funeral arrangements are going to be or what kind of pain management they want. And so it sounds like I have a lot of duties on the living, and so I'll go do it because I'm a good daughter. But it doesn't want me to rush out and say, I need to sit down for hours and with the potential of maybe having a conversation that I can have meaning out of it. But if we can illustrate to individuals that I get something out of this, selfishly as that sounds, we communicate for selfish reasons. So if I can let people know that you're going to get messages of love and find out more about who you are, and understand that relationships are created every day in the little moments and not necessarily always in the big moments, I think that you'll actually have more individuals better prepared when their loved one's dying, and then therefore they will be a better team member at the end of life for the doctors, for the social workers, and for the dying person. Living perspectives, generally unknown. There's nothing out there, but I've been looking at it for 5 years. There is now, by the way. Just look under Keeley. There are no guiding norms for living regarding appropriate behavior at the end of life. Again, we all need models and norms and expectations in order to feel more comfortable about talking with someone. Think about any presentation that you've ever given. You feel a lot better after somebody's told you how to do it, or you've done it once or twice. Same thing with dyadic communication. We need some norms and some guidelines. And we have to look at more concrete research that clarifies the communication. In the medical area, and I consider myself a relational scholar who looks at communication in health crises, we really need to understand more about this component, and so that's what Elaine and I are trying to do, and there's a number of researchers across the nation who are trying to incorporate communication into the health field, because we think that we're a missing link that can enhance all of our interactions at the end of life. So, in other words, if the living become more comfortable talking with the dying, I truly believe that the professional work will become easier, because they'll be more comfortable, first of all, talking with you and asking you questions. They'll be more comfortable talking and find out more about what the dying needs, so therefore maybe they can give you that information if you're the social worker or the nurse or the doctor. It's just opening up conversations and communication will make everybody who works in this field job a little bit easier. So, the research question that I looked at, the overarching research question for the start of this project, and really the overarching project, is what are the messages, verbal and nonverbal, that are reported to have been exchanged during final conversations. Then we looked at the functions also. How did I do this? I did I can't say that word today. Thank you. Try being a communication professor and not being able to say a word. It's a snowball technique. You know, I couldn't go into my students and say, hey, I'll give you extra credit to come talk to me. No. They actually had to have real experience with it, and they had to want to come talk to me. And so people started calling me. I mean, they actually had to call me for an interview. There were flyers out, there was a web page out, there was a brief newspaper article, but primarily it was people telling others I was doing this kind of research, and they said, hey, I'd like to come talk to you and share my story with you. And there was a 6-step process. First, you can't ask people to come in and spill their guts to you, essentially. without getting acquainted. And so that getting acquainted process sometimes would take an hour or 2 hours. But essentially they had to be comfortable with me and the goal that why I was doing this work is I was not paying them. I was not giving them any extra credit. I gave them my ear. I listened to them. And then I wanted to know who died and what did they die of? Was it their mother, their husband? Was it their child? And what did they die of? And it's amazing what that did for them, just to have someone ask about someone who had died. I had a basic demographic questionnaire so I could make sense of the race and the age and all those kinds of things. They had to sign an informed consent form, a focusing exercise. Again, I was doing retrospective interviews, so they had to reflect back. And so I started with the definition that I showed you earlier, final conversations, and then 2 words, I remember, and ... And then I had lines and lines on 4, 5, 6 pages. And they just started writing for 10 minutes without raising their pencil, without worrying about spelling, without worrying about grammar. And it's amazing how it helped rush things back for them. And then we did our interview, and the interviews lasted anywhere from an hour to 3 or 4 hours. Most lasted about an hour and a half, I would say. And then I would say 90% of the people cried, right? Because they're thinking about a very profound time in their life. So you don't just say, oh, thank you very much, I got what I want, bye-bye. So often the debriefing would take another hour. And every single person, when we got done, gave me a hug. Almost every single person. I think maybe every person did. And they thanked me for having the opportunity to talk about their conversation. They were shocked at how much they remembered. And then I often received emails or phone calls a day or 2 later saying, I've been on a high since I talked with you. What a wonderful experience. So it was very cathartic to talk about this experience. And that was even more telling to me about how important these conversations are and why I need to continue looking at it. Who are the participants? Julie and I talked with 82 individuals, 75% female, 25% male. That shouldn't be a shock to you. Who are the caregivers at the end of life? And it primarily is women, first of all. And also, this is an emotional subject. And so, if you're going to come talk about something that knows emotional, a woman's more likely to come do that and be willing to share that story than a man who doesn't know me, and I am a woman and a stranger. It was 89% white, 6% Hispanic, 3% Asian, 2% African American. And that just happened to be the individuals who came to us. I would love to see what this would look like with more proportional percentages, especially living in Texas. I mean, I really wish that Hispanic was like 40% there. It's interesting, when I looked at the stories of the individuals who are Hispanics versus whites or anything else, the stories are very similar. I mean, I think that our end-of-life experiences, many are similar. Our cultural expectations are different, but our experiences are similar. And people ranged in age from 21 to 85. Most people were 30s and 40s and 50s. 63% were immediate family, 31.5% were extended family members, aunt, uncle, grandchild. 5.5% were close friends, but they bragged about they were closer than family. I was like her sister. Majority of the interviews took place between 5 to 7 years after the interview. The range was 33 months to 21 years. The 21 years, this is after that conversation, 21 years later. This man was a 70-something-year-old gentleman, and he remembered specifically what his conversation was. Roy, it was Roy, and he said, you don't forget that kind of experience. It's one of my most precious memories. It's one of my most important conversations I've ever had in my entire life. And the 3-month, that was actually the worst interview I had, because she was still in the process of grieving. So she wanted to process the death, which I sat there for 5 hours and processed the death with her. But there wasn't a whole lot about the conversation. She didn't have the energy or the time or the focus to focus just on the communication, even though I try to bring her back gently every once in a while. So in this instance, I was really happy that if I was going to do an interview, that's retrospective. So what are the 5 most common topics of final conversations? And you can see this love and then I love you goodbye. Love is like the overarching thesis. I love you goodbye is the chapter. And just to give you a sense of how this book lays itself out. And I'll talk about each of these briefly. Identity. Identity really has to do with who these individuals saw themselves to be. And they, most of our identity is arrived from our conversations with people we love. You know, our parents, our siblings, when we're very young. At the end of life, these conversations are very important because the person who is dying often knows us very well, and we trust them. We figure they're dying, they're not going to be lying to me. And so identity became a very important issue. In the book, it comes up, we filtered it out into growing up, maturing through final conversations, and then going on, new directions for the living. Because these identity messages, we're doing those things for the living. The third one was spirituality, religious messages. We call this grace happens. Normally it's colon spiritual messages. Someone just wrote us a review of this book and said, wow, I can't believe that you actually talked about spirituality. So many people want to sidestep it and let someone else do it. Let the chaplain do it. I don't know how we could have sidestepped it. It's such an important message at the end of life. And these individuals who had these conversations, and we had 67% of our sample talked about these messages, where finding out that somebody you love is dying or finding out that you're going to die, often the literature will tell you that it makes us doubt God or be angry with God and have this difficult relationship for a temporary time, if not forever. These final conversations, when I asked them what the conversations did for them, when faith would come up, direct messages of faith or religious belief or spiritual experiences, and I'll show one of each in a few minutes, they said it helped confirm and validate their feelings. It was the actual talking. Maybe they were still mad at God, but actually having the conversations with the dying had profound impact on their belief system. Everyday talk. In the book, it's called Everyday Messages, Taking Care of Business. You all know probably better than almost any other group that I will ever talk with, you cannot have a profound conversation every time someone new walks in the door. It's exhausting. And you cannot have a profound conversation with that daughter who comes 4 or 5 times in the last 6 weeks or 9 weeks or 4 months of the person's life to have a profound conversation. One, there's not that many profound things to talk about. 2, you're tired, you're hurting. The dying person is tired and they're hurting. And maybe they just don't have it in them. There's nothing there for them to talk about. And we had quite a few people who were angry about that. So I was waiting for this profound conversation. You know, what is profound is the fact that we create and maintain our relationships every day through the everyday talk. That is how you keep a marriage healthy. That is how a child knows that they are loved and how they are going to grow up. It's the everyday little things. That in itself should be profound. People need to recognize that importance at the end of life. And so we talk about everyday messages and how if you don't get the profound message, you can't make someone talk to you. You can't, shake them and say, talk to me. What was the most important thing in your life? You. I love you. And then they go, that's it? I've waited all this for this? Yes, that's it. Look at these other messages. They're there. They're important. Closure of a difficult relationship. In the book, it's called Heartache Released, Healing Damaged Relationships. I was fortunate to have 20% of the individuals that we talked with come talk to us about a really horrible relationship. Maybe a parent was alcoholic or they were just abusive. I mean, we all don't have perfect relationships. And it makes sense that most people who would volunteer and choose to come talk to me, they'd be about positive relationships. So I felt very blessed that anybody would talk to me about a horrible relationship. And what did these conversations look like and what did they do for them? And I'll talk briefly about each one of these right now. So 98% questions, and I'm kind of whipping through.
What did you say your sample size was?
82.
82.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
82 interviews. We had 1,300 single-space pages of data that we went through. It's no wonder that I've been working on this project for 5 years. So, 98% of the individuals we talked with talked about messages of love, which is comforting. We would all expect that love is the most important message. There was one guy who didn't talk about love, and I asked Daryl, and most of these people, 90% of these people use their real name, and Daryl's his real name. In fact, I had to go get changed the IRB because I had a, we're going to do a pseudonym, and they said, no, this is my story, my name, which I also thought was an interesting and important statement. Daryl said he didn't say I love you because he's in his 70s. His mother Mona was dying and she was 95. He said, Maureen, he said, we shared a cocktail every day. We talked about the stock market. I named a street after her. I took care of her. I bought her house. I bought her car. My mother knew I loved her, and she knew I loved me, and how silly we would have sounded saying I love you to each other. There was this real old-fashioned Irish family where they didn't say I love you, and so I laughed. I said, okay. But it was known. Many of these were very direct declarations of I love you, and I really thought this chapter would end up being about 3 pages, because how interesting can you make I love you sound? Oh, it's not 3 pages long. I'll give you some examples in a minute. They also talked about how important it was to say I love you lots of times. For some individuals, it was just the first time they'd ever heard it, which was amazing to me, but it was the first time they'd ever heard I love you. For others, it was repeated, they would say 1,000 times. Every time they saw them, every time they hung up the phone. One woman talked about her husband who was dying in her arms. He had a very bad, chronic bad heart, and she knew he was dying. And she said, I loved you probably 20 times just in those last few moments. because she said, I remembered reading that the hearing apparatus is the last sense to go, so I knew he could hear me if I kept telling him I loved him, and that's what he needed to hear. And all of these direct messages were emphasized by nonverbal acts of affection: holding hands, stroking of the face, looking in each other's eyes, kisses, sometimes laying in the same bed with the dying person. So here's Ellen. She said, so many times in life, if you're smart enough of a human being to actually convey to the person that you love them, while it has meaning and while it has emotion, and I'm not belittling any of that, I'm just saying that we knew we were going to be separated. I needed to be able to be complete with him and to let him know that I've always loved him and that I always would love him, and that it was a privilege for me to grow up and spend my life with him. Again, I think the power in these is actually for people to hear and see real examples for the first time, for many of them, first time in their life. BJ was talking about the message of love in a relationship with her mother-in-law, who was a good woman, but not a very demonstrative woman, and they had their issues. At one point, she told me in the interview that her mother-in-law had told her son, don't marry that woman, she's not a good match for you. I mean, so they had some history. And this is what she said. So I've come to tell you I love you, and I know that you love me. And she said, absolutely. I feel the same way about you. You've been a great daughter-in-law. She basically said, I feel exactly the same way. She didn't elaborate because she wouldn't ever do that. That just wasn't who she was. She didn't normally go there, so she let me tell her how I felt about her, and then she told me how she felt about me the way she could. And thank God I knew who she was. She never did say she loved me. But I knew she loved me. What she said was enough. She didn't have to say the word L-O-V-E, right? All she said before was, I feel the same way about you. She couldn't get the words out to her daughter-in-law. But she said that was the first time she'd ever really heard anything close to that message, and it was very profound and very important to her. She was holding her mother-in-law's hand and her husband's hand, the son's hand, at the moment of the mother's death, and she talked about how important this was. Identity was the second major category. 75% of the people we talked with had a final conversation that triggered some kind of examination of their identity. And perhaps it was triggered by somebody saying, you're beautiful, you're smart. In other instances, it might have been the living person having to say, what am I going to do without you? And they go, I know you can do it. And then they find their own voice and they start saying, well, I guess I could do this. And the dying just kind of supports and encourages it. Sometimes the individual found out that they were very strong, or that they were a better caregiver, or that they were a better daughter than they ever expected, and that helped them. So the living talked about how they reevaluated or redefined themselves at the end of life, from final conversations. And these messages stay, well, I think all these messages stay with the individuals. The dying had an opportunity to compliment and thereby bolster the self-esteem of the living. So we had a lot of people saying, you're the smartest grandchild, or you're the, oh, Roy, that guy I was talking about earlier, the 70-year-old gentleman, he talked about his mother telling him a story at the end of life, and he said he knew he was the most loved of all of his brothers, and there was like 3 sons, because she told him a story that no one else, that she didn't tell anyone else, so therefore he knew he was the most important son. You know, and so they take meaning from these little instances. The dying gave final insights into who they thought the living were, strengths, gifts, and talents. Occasionally, there would be some criticism in there from the dying, but mostly it was not harsh criticism. It might have been, I'm tired of you putting yourself down, you're beautiful, pick yourself up, you have to believe in yourself before anyone else can believe in you. And they talked about how the living might go on after the death, because many individuals, I had one woman who was in her mid-30s who was losing the love of her life, and she had 2 small daughters, and she looked at her husband and said, I can't go on without you, I'm going to die with you. And he was still strong enough. He swung her around and held her and said, yes, you can, you will go on, because you have to. We have 2 children here, and you're not giving yourself enough credit. You know, and I think also, I will still be around, you know, you'll know I'm around. But she said from that moment on, she grew up, because he was right. Who else was going to take care of those babies, those 2 girls? So here's one message. This is Tori. Tori's 19-year-old brother was dying. He had cancer. And he said, I'm going to miss the fact that you always have a Band-Aid for my wounds. I didn't realize that I did anything like that for you. I guess I gave him another way of looking at things, or just listening. It was such a good feeling for him to say that, because all this time I thought I was more needy of him than he was of me. And then the next story is actually Tori's mother. I talked to both these individuals. It was really interesting to look at the family dynamics. And he talked about Jacob was her son, and Tori's brother. And Gloria just graduated last May from Texas State University, the first person in her family to ever get a college degree. She's a 48-year-old Hispanic woman. Never ever imagined going to college. And she went because her son told her she should. He said, I want you to go back to school so then I can go back to school. I said, but Jacob, you're always wanting to be a coach and a math teacher. He says, well, maybe I'll do that. I think they both knew that he was dying. In fact, I know for a fact, she said for a fact they both knew he was dying, but they were trying, this is how they were talking about it. You can't really come out and say, I know you're going to die. But he was essentially saying, go for me too. I can't go, so go for me too. But how they were kind of dancing around it was saying, well, I'll go back when I get better, but you go now. She said, I'll become a lawyer, and then later on I'll become a lawyer, and I'll come with you. But he said, you need to be a lawyer, Mom. He wanted her to go work with the underprivileged, especially the Hispanics in the San Marcos area. And she just graduated, and she's a social worker, working with that population. And she said she hasn't decided she's going to go back to law school. You know, at 48 years old, maybe she can still meet her calling by helping young women in this area. But she said she went back because Jacob told her she should, and never would have considered it beforehand. The third category is spirituality and religious faith messages. 67% of the individuals I talked with talked about some sort of religious belief or spiritual view. The individuals who had these conversations, the living, came away with a validation of their beliefs. And many of these people did not start, some started with, they had been like a lapsed Catholic, or they didn't necessarily believe in God anymore. Some had a very strong faith already. So it was the wide range of what you would find in any community. The validation occurred in three ways. First was an affirmation of religious and spiritual beliefs. Second was a restoration of a dormant belief system, so maybe they were taught as a child, but they hadn't been practicing for a long time. Third was an acknowledgement of a perceptual shift in belief. So maybe there was one gentleman who was an elder in the church and was very religious, but his mother, this is Roy, his mother told him about this spiritual experience that had happened to her, and he said at that moment he became more spiritual and believed that people can contact you after death, and that God actually can give you direct messages, and it's not just through the minister. And so he said, I became spiritual because of that. He said, I still remained an elder for many years, but he said, I became spiritual. My whole belief system altered. So this is Karen, and Karen's father died when she was 15. There were 3 children in the family. The youngest was 3 years old, and he was dying of cancer. And here's what she told me. The most profound thing was his declaration. He said, you don't need to worry about me. He said, I'm going to heaven. Jesus is my Savior, and He is yours too. And don't you ever forget it. I'm going to heaven, and I'm going to be fine. It was very fulfilling and very reaffirming. It's had a big impact on my faith and my spirituality. Very comforting in a way to see the way my father handled it. He was so sure. And she went on to talk about how in college she had many friends who stopped going to church or who had lapses in faith, and she said she never has ever had any lapse in her faith. Because she saw her dad walk up to death and just say, I'll see you when you get to heaven. This is just a temporary goodbye. And so she still is a very devout Christian. Betty Lynn, now this is one of the spiritual experiences. Betty Lynn was raised in a Church of Christ, a very fundamental church. And she said she wasn't supposed to believe any of this. And she was at the hospital visiting this person who's like a surrogate father to her, and she was exhausted. It was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. She stepped out of the room for a little bit, went to go lay down in this lounger, and she closed her eyes. And her eyes are closed when she sees this. She said, all of a sudden I could see the ceiling in the room I was in, and this light came and just settled in on top of me, and I could feel the Spirit in me. I wasn't scared. It didn't bother me. I just laid there, and I smiled, and I said to myself, I said, Cece, it's okay. You can go, you can go. And in about 15 minutes of that acceptance, my eyes still shut, and I'm holding this presence in me and saying, it's okay, you can go, you can go. My eyes still shut. I could see it come up above me. It's the energy and the light she's talking about. And just for a split second it hovered, there, and then it went out the window of the hospital, and within about 2 minutes, 3 minutes, I heard him call code blue. It was CC, he was gone. As you all know, much better than I do, many of the dying are waiting for permission to die from the individuals they're closest to know that they're going to be okay. And he needed to know, and she went on in this is a very, in the book it's like two or three pages long, she was promising him she would also take care of Ruth, who was her surrogate mother, and that he didn't have to worry about her, and that was her big goal. She and a number of other people that I interviewed talked about how this type of experience felt like it changed their life in that they felt they were called to be a midwife at death, and that's the language they used. And so she has become, she was in the farming industry. This is a tough 50-something-year-old woman. She was in the farming industry for years, probably the first woman in that field in Texas. And now she went back to school for a counseling degree. She is a counselor, and she does lots of different types of counseling, but one of them is grief counseling. And she said she just finds herself called to the bedside of many people who are dying, and she is a midwife to death for the dying, but also for those other family members who are in the room to help them learn how to do it. And so it was this experience, she said, that called her to that new profession. Everyday talk. 51% of the individuals express the importance of everyday talk. What I was shocked at is that they knew it was important. I know it's important from my research and from my studies, but they told me it was important. It wasn't just, so the other 49%, I guarantee you they had everyday talk. They just didn't realize how important it was, and so they didn't identify it as such. Everyday talk is an essential component of maintaining the relationship. It, first of all, provides avenues for humor and light talk. Again, because we need humor and light talk at the end of life for the dying and the living. It demonstrated a willingness and genuine desire to talk. The fact that you show up every day, or you show up once a week at the same time every day, or you make that phone call if you live states when you can't fly home, but you make those phone calls. That willingness, desire to talk, to say, hey, how are you doing, keeps that connection. It lets the dying know that they're important. It lets everybody else in that family know that those relationships are important. And the fact that you get access to that dying also should tell you that you're important. And these talks, and again, we're talking about, let's talk about the weather, let's talk about the UT football score, or let's talk about politics, let's talk about the stock markets, let's gossip about people in the family, let's talk about your grades and what did you do at school that day. And it was interesting because the dying, one woman put it beautifully, the dying, her father was dying, and she'd come in every day, and she was trying to think how to be profound so that in case she didn't see him again, and he wanted to say, how was that spelling test today? What did you get on it? What words did you miss? And she was getting frustrated, going, I don't want to talk about, some stupid spelling test. I want to, and she goes, oh, this is how he's my dad. He was staying a dad with her until the day he died. That's when she got how profound it was, that she had to do all these things with her, because that's how he could stay a dad, was to talk to her about her school grades or that science project.
Did she figure that out before or afterwards?
No, she figured it out later.
Oh.
She figured out in the discussion that was important to her.
When she was talking
Yes.
with him?
Yeah,
Or with you?
she figured out, at the time she knew it was important to his dad, to her dad.
Okay.
So at that time, when they were doing the conversations, she said, I let him do it. I didn't quite understand why he wanted to do it. And then as she's talking with me, she goes, oh, that's how he stayed my dad. Which is why I also think it's valuable to talk about these final conversations.
That's what I mean.
Right, with our sisters and our brothers and our moms, and many of these people said no one ever talked to me about these final conversations. No one ever asked me, hey, did you ever get to talk to your dad when he was dying? And what'd you say, or what do you mean? Because we think it's interfering. Again, we're not allowed to talk about that. If I talk about it, it's going to come to me, right? No. They felt so relieved. They felt blessed, and they were on a high. Most of these people were on a high for a day to 2 days after they talked to me, because they had all these memories rushing back. But they said it's important. This man was very profound. He talked about both his mother and his father's passing in conversations. So he did 2 interviews with me. And he talked about, he said, videotaping and talking with his mother, who he had a pretty good relationship with. His father was one of the more difficult relationships. Here's what he said about his mother. He said, we realized at the time that the interactions that were going on were really important, and that it wasn't just that we were videotaping some kind of major event. We were videotaping the mundane, unimportant things on the surface. But there were some real valuable things happening during that sharing. You could see little microcosms of my family on it. My sisters and me kind of over talking to my mom. And that's what I do think everyday conversations are. They're little microcosms of your life. And we dismiss them as unimportant, but think about if you didn't get that morning kiss or the kiss hello when you get home, or the how's your day honey, or the quick phone call in the middle of the day thinking about you, what's going on, or if you didn't get that snuggle from your little one at night. You know, it's the everyday little stuff that creates and maintains our relationships. And the everyday talk allow these individuals to be a dad until the day they died, or to be a mom until the day they died, or to be whatever you need to be, but to have that relationship until the relationship was over. And then they would reflect back on it, so they also felt like they got to continue the relationship after, because they were authentic and true and genuine with the relationship, because they didn't hide from it. Closure of a difficult relationship. 20% of the conversations that we talked with the individuals we talked with focused on closure of a difficult relationship. The same 20% were the only participants that self-described their relationships with the deceased to be historically difficult. And they were horrific. Every single person within this 20% of the group talked about the value and importance of cleaning up their relationship so they would not be left with any regrets. They described these as difficult but imperative. And these were not conversations. When I first started doing the research, I had colleagues early on in the presentation say, well, are you getting lots of messages of forgiveness? And I hadn't received really any at that point, and I received only a few. If you say, I forgive you. So if I look at Elaine, I go, I forgive you. I really have just threatened her face. I forgive you for what? You know, so it gets your guard up and go, oh, I did the best I could. I didn't, you know, I don't need your forgiveness, right? So those words didn't happen very often. They were done in a number of different ways. Each of these people, and understand, I was talking with the living, so you often want to make yourself look better anyway. So I'm not saying that the dying don't ever start these conversations. I bet they do. In these instances, they did not. They took on the role of peacemaker or healer. They're the ones who started to initiate the conversation. They found to reconcile without threatening the face, without causing more pain or grief. Can you imagine how horrible you feel if you go into your mom or dad, or whoever was horrible to you, and say, you son of a gun, you are a horrible father. You're kicking somebody when they're down. It doesn't make you feel better to kick somebody when they're dying and in pain, and you know they are, you can see it. But they had to find a way to start a conversation where they felt some peace and closure for their own welfare, because if they didn't, they were going to take all this anger with them. I also am very careful when I give these presentations, and in the book, very careful, saying we cannot guarantee that you're going to have a great conversation. We can't guarantee it'll be a nice conversation. People, as you know, die the way they lived. If it's a nasty son of a gun, they're going to die as a nasty son of a gun. They don't get sweet hours before they die or 2 weeks before they die. They're the same kind of person. And some people avoid it. One individual we talked with, the sister was really trying to reconcile the relationship because she knew her brother was dying, and he said, no, why would I want to talk to you now? Just because I'm dying? That's fake. But a week or two later, he called her and said, hey, I want to leave something for my grandchildren. Would you help me write my life story? Even though he's mad at her. And in those conversations, so you never know when the next one is going to open. She just kept trying and wasn't pushing it. Just said, I'm here. I love you. I know we've had our issues. We can take some time if you want. And through those conversations of telling his life story, they had healed. They had taken care of their relationship. In another instance, Holland, his mother, she was abused. She was an alcoholic, but not the entire period of his life. And during some of the final conversations, she would say things like, you think you're so good? You're going to be just like me. You're going to be an alcoholic just like me. And he would really trash him and tear him down, and he'd have to get some space away. His conversation came through a nonverbal. She was essentially in a coma. She was on medicine, probably morphine, and he was sitting next to her and talking with her. And when he was having this conversation, she would squeeze his hand. She couldn't stop him from saying the things he had to say finally. And so that was, I think, important to say too. Sometimes you have to wait until they can't fight you back, you know. And he was 21 years old when he was telling me the story, and he was 19 when she was dying. And he'd been on his own since he was 16. So I was able to express my love for her, and I could just sit down and explain to her that she did succeed in life, and she didn't have to think of herself as a failure, and I could tell her I loved her without her disapproving eyes or somehow blocking the conversation. It was always just close-ended for everything. And without her being able to talk, I was able to have a more beneficial and meaningful conversation with her. I was able to release a lot of things that I needed to tell her, that she needed to know before she died, that I needed to have her know before she died. Because before that, I wasn't able to tell her that I'm the person I am today because of the man she made me. And he was probably a year or two away from graduating from college, and he just graduated also. So he's making something in his life. Catherine talked about her mother. Her mother was just mean. She would throw things and say mean things, but she didn't say nice things, but she was a doer. She thought, I can show you I love you by doing your laundry or by making you dinner. And so Catherine said, it took me days to get myself ready to tell her that I love her, but I knew that it was my assignment. It took me weeks of processing and going and not saying it and going home and thinking I didn't do it. And it just had so much emotional baggage with it because she had never told me that she loved me. I knew intellectually that I would be so angry if I didn't get this done, and she died. How wasteful. How the conversation finally came up is this mother threw, in the book, and she's like another 2 or 3 pages in the book, she threw her whole dinner tray at the hospital and said, no one loves me, was ranting and raving, and Catherine finally sat there and said, I do love you, and she had to think about what the mother had done. She said she'd gone back to college because her mother had watched her kids. She was a great grandmother, so she started identifying the things that her mother had done for her. And she realized that this woman was pretty bitter at the end of her life, and that she had been divorced, Catherine had been divorced for 15 years, and she was a bitter woman. But by having this conversation, she said, I let go a lot of anger. I saw who I didn't want to be at my deathbed. Her father died within 3 months of this, or 6 months of this, and within 3 months after that, she fell in love and got married. She said, I never would have been open to love or any kind of caring, warm relationship if I hadn't had that conversation. And she just laid it out there. She just started saying, thank you for taking care of my kids when I was in college. Thank you for doing all the things that you do at church for all the people that you do things at church. Look at how people are bringing flowers. And so she just kind of let it out there. And it also helped her see how many different ways people show love, even if they can't say I love you. There's a chapter in this book called Beyond Words, The Power of Nonverbal Communication. In my academic work, I talk about the verbal and nonverbal together because I think messages of love are done together. But when you're trying to also teach lay people, most people don't understand what nonverbal is, and so we try and teach them. We talk about symbolic things, and we talk about all sorts of different aspects of nonverbal. 84% of the individuals talked about nonverbal examples without me having to ask about them, and then I did ask about them. The ones I'll talk about today are just touch, eyes, face, body, and time. Victoria, she was the 35-year-old soon-to-be young widow, and her husband was dying. He said, I want the luxury of being held to earth only by your love, not to be connected to anything else that afternoon. That afternoon, I just cuddled up in the bed with them, and he was crying. And then later I went in, and we didn't talk because we both, I think, felt like words would hold him, and there wasn't any reason to hold him to earth any longer. This was probably in the middle of the afternoon. He died that night at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he was trying not to use morphine because it made him feel strange. So he said he didn't feel pain if she held him, and that's what she did. And Holland again talked about hands. The squeezes from her hand were reiterating that she was underneath, even if she wasn't able to explain or verbally express what she was feeling. Time. Time talks, the importance of time and giving up to give time to their dying loved ones is a way to communicate their love to people. So Catherine talked about, she's one I just talked about the horrible relationship with her mother. She was, the asterisk means that is not her real name. She was a working single mother with 2 teenage sons, and she talked about the difficulty but importance of spending hours every evening with her dying mother. She'd go to work, she was a nurse, and then she'd come take care of her mother at the nursing home, and then go home and take care of her teenage sons. The dying also acknowledged that the time benefited them as much. So Kathy talked about how the FC helped me change. I had to learn to accept death. If I had not had that, if I hadn't been able to say those things, spend that time with them, and have those last few days and make that transition, I think it would be a lot different. At one point, Kathy and her husband talked about them separating because they didn't think she could handle his dying. And then she realized, no, I can do this, and she spent that time. And she said if she had done that, she would still be stuck back in that death. Victoria, this is about looking at the last look at the end of life. He woke up right moments before he died and looked straight at her, and I had many people tell that experience. Ruth was Victoria's daughter, and was 5 when her daddy was dying. He talked about how the fact that he actually made eye contact with her and had a conversation with her, and it was important because he was talking to me like I was a real person, not like I was this little 4-year-old. It was like my dad told me, you're going to be all right. So, you know, it can have those kind of meanings. Okay. I think I'm going to stop there in case you all have questions. Essentially, I'm going to put these up here for you real quick. I'm hoping what you walk away today knowing is that the average person is frightened of death and they're frightened of phone conversations. We need to give them models, and so that's what I'm hoping I'm doing with this book and with my research. The living need help, all of our help and our expertise, and part of that expertise is how do you do it? And what are some models? Doctors, nurses, social workers. I don't see these people when they're in this crisis. You see them. And so if you can encourage them to have fun conversations, tell them about the book, ask questions, then I think that we'll get the word out, and they'll start finding places where they can find the help that they need. And I'm asking you, please go beyond communication's good and necessary for the dying. Again, that sounds like it's a duty. If you also tell people that it's good and necessary for them, that it can give them messages that they'll carry with them for the rest of their life, they'll be more willing to have these conversations. That's fears. Trying to get to the place where we don't have regrets. What kind of questions do you have?
Open it for questions.
I'd actually like to ask a question. While I really appreciate what you've done here, and I wonder if you've actually explored or played with the idea of exploring feelings of healthcare professionals who also struggle with the same issues of FDI. Have you considered that at all?
This has been a program of research that I expect I'll be working in this field for the next, probably for the rest of my career, because this is my calling. This is where I want to be. That's one of the areas we've talked about, looking at it. There's an excellent book out right now by Alyssa Foster, and she talks about it from a hospice volunteer perspective. I should have got her book, but you can find that on Amazon.com. Her name is Foster. Alyssa Foster, and she wrote a book about, it's an ethnographic book about the hospice volunteer experience. But yes, absolutely. I think talking with the volunteers, the nurses, the social workers, and the doctors about their experiences. That's some of what Elaine is doing here also, a little bit. We're touching upon it. Yeah. It's amazing. We can count on one hand how many of us are in the field of communication. We're looking at end of life. And we think it's amazing that we're an hour and a half away from each other, and that perhaps we can start doing more of this. So, yeah.
Have you done any research on people that don't attend that kind of conversation?
I actually think that's the next book.
Yeah.
Julie and I have talked about that. We have 2 or 3 book ideas. One is that book, but the one we keep going back to is I had so many people who want to talk to me about they didn't have that experience. What do they do? And I'll probably have them reflect back, one, on the conversation they did have the last time we talked, so they remember whatever they had, and then what is it like not having these conversations. Honestly, I actually think it's a blessing when we know someone we love is dying, because you have to slow down and have these conversations. Because the biggest regret you hear from people is, he had a heart attack, I didn't get to say goodbye, I didn't get to say I love you, and then there's all these other conversations they didn't get to have. So Julie and I have 2 or 3 books that we want to do, and I'll continue the academic research part of it as well. And so they actually are in journals that you all can find, the Journal of Social and Personal Relationship, communication monographs. So there's lots of communication research, well, not lots, there is some communication research out there that I think will help. But again, I think it's a brand new area for communication researchers. I'm only 45, I expect and I have 2 small children, I expect I'll be in this field for at least 20 or 30 more years. Everybody know that the hills of Texas State, they're going to be taking a wheelchair, pushing me up the hills.
Do you address in the book then the instances where the meaning of what went on occurred during your conversation, during the interview?
Yes, we try to do it subtly. We try to do it subtly.
That's
the
development of the understanding of meaning is very interesting.
We do 2 things in here. One is we organize this according to different categories, and then we talk about the benefits of spiritual messages or benefits of everyday talk, and that's where it's developed.
Okay.
And then at the end of every chapter, we have this thing called Advice from the Living, and we have bullet points for people who don't want to read the entire book. They can just go and say, okay, tell me the top 10 things I need to know, from that chapter. And maybe they'll get interested enough and they'll read examples from that chapter. This book is arranged so that they don't have to read the entire book. They can just read parts of it. I don't think this kind of book you sit down and read in one night unless you happen to be in the field. And then we have the last chapter, chapter 9 is called You Can Too, and it's communication advice, how to have a more effective final conversation. But yes. Okay. Other question?
Right here. Just see if there's any other questions.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.